Too often, revenue teams spend their time cleaning messy data and debating its actual integrity, rather than using it for insights. The Data Hub is designed to change that by centralizing, structuring, and enriching your data so that it's ready for planning, execution, and review. In this video, we'll show you how the Data Hub works and how to set it up in Vasco. First, let's connect to our sources. You'll want to go to Data and then Connectors and Sources. Here, you'll be able to connect to your CRM and or billing tool. By doing so, you'll simply click on the Connect button, where you'll then be presented with an authorization page that will allow you to connect to your CRM. On the Stripe end, the more common use case is for customers that don't have necessarily all info flowing into their CRM, where any changes in billing will then impact a change in revenue being recorded in Vasco. So here you'll actually configure the Stripe connection and decide how it will then create upgrades, downgrades, churn events, and or post-closing upgrades and downgrades. Here you can also have multiple CRM connections. So I can have multiple HubSpot accounts connected and or multiple different types of CRMs connected. We'll cover in the data enrichment rules how you can then auto reconcile accounts coming from multiple sources. Now let's discuss the journey editor. To access the journey editor, I can go to Data, and then under Data Model, I'll have my Customer Journeys tab. This is where you'll define your lifecycle stages, your channel attribution, and even the handoffs between functions and their respective responsibilities. Let's start with the lifecycle stages. The lifecycle stages are named following the Winning by Design frameworks. So we see lead, MQL, SQL, SAL, and customer. And on the right side of the bow tie, anything that's activation, retention, contraction, expansion, and so on. These names, however, can be changed if you have a different naming convention. So to do so, I would click on the given name of the stage, and here you'll be presented other options, and you can even create your custom label if you wish. At this point, you can set your reporting preference for the given metric, whether it's count or dollar value. If I prefer to report on SQLs as the count of SQLs versus the dollar value of SQLs, I would simply select the count. Now let's define all the various lifecycle stages and how Vasco should read the data coming from the CRM. I can either access the lifecycle events by accessing the menu bar on the right-hand side that allows you to then click on events, and I can then click into new lead, new MQL, new SQL, so on and so forth. You can also access the lifecycle event definitions by clicking on the icon that appears above the metric. So if I wish to define new lead, I can simply click on that icon, and here I'll be presented the screen that allows me to set the conditions, the trigger dates, and the objects at which define that specific event. Note that if you are pulling from multiple sources, multiple CRMs that is, you'll be given an option to also decide which CRM you're pulling from. There's an and or definition. So if I am pulling from multiple sources, multiple objects, I can have different definitions that act then as those or statements. What is important to note is for each of these definitions, you'll set the object at which you'll be reading from. It's important that there is a trigger date. So think of it as the date at which an account becomes a lead, an MQL or an SQL. And then any conditions that you would set to further filter out or include certain accounts or certain events. So a common use case would be excluding a specific lead status or lifecycle stage as other, or maybe a partner tag that would otherwise mean that it's not a lead. Then for deal value and quota attribution, you'll be able to set the respective fields that make up both of those metrics. So if I have an amount field that is being tracked at the new lead stage, I can map it. And same with quota attribution, whoever's responsible for the new leads, whether that's the contact owner, I could set that field to be the one at which we read. Once I've decided and I'm happy with the specific definition, I would simply save. And then the data that responds and that corresponds to those conditions would then be pulled and recognized under new lead. Between events, you'll notice that there are two additional sub-events, if you wish, called stalled events and lost events. Stalled is time-bound, so it's the amount of time at which we want to record an event to be, or an account to be recorded as stalled. Lost is when you would then consider that account lost. So it's a set of actual conditions that I can then set at which makes up what is a lost event tied to that account. Between SAL and customer, or within that closing stage, you can add sub-stages. So think of this as possibly your opportunity stages or your deal stages that make up those events or that progression of a deal in a more granular fashion. So here you can actually add any sub-stage, and the definitions would essentially read from the pipeline and the stage that corresponds to that pipeline. And then, if you're applying it to a single or multiple motion. There are additional events that can be mapped where if you have, let's say, post-closing upsells, post-closing downgrades that are essentially changes to the original deal, but that should impact new business revenue, these can be mapped as well. There is additional new customers coming from expansion. So let's say there's an existing customer that adds a second location. Some companies might want to consider this an expansion opportunity, so you can measure that accordingly. Beyond the lifecycle events, there are motions. Motions is how you will segment your business at a high level. So the more common examples are business sizes at which you're targeting. So SMBs versus mid-market versus enterprise. In other cases, it's geographies. And in other cases, it could be product lines. There are major implications in terms of creating multiple motions because each specific motion will have its own customer journey, and also each motion will have its own top-down, bottom-up plan, as well as costs and unit economics. When I create my various motions here, I'll then want to map them to the CRM. And these will be specific fields or properties that will allow us to segment the data. I will want to use the same objects that are used within my lifecycle stages. So if I have maybe contact that's used from lead to SQL and then deal from SAL to one, I'll want to use and have definitions on both of these objects. The logic works as a waterfall. So Vasco will first read the definitions or the rules in order of priority from top to down. So if I have a catch-all at the last in the last rule, this can act as a way to have the data fall under one motion where it's not necessarily recognized and picked up in the prior conditions and rules. Once I'm happy with the definitions, I'll simply save, and then Vasco will sort the data by the respective motions. We then have the channels. Channels are where you set your sources at which you acquire your business. So these are categorized by inbound, outbound, and partnerships at a higher category level. In a lot of cases, we'll create more granular channels. So maybe inbound paid, inbound organic, inbound event, and categorize it under inbound, and same for outbound and partnership. Think of this as the way that you'll typically plan, as there are respective conversion forecasts, ACV, and time forecasts that are set for each respective channel. Once I have my channels created, you'll want to connect them to the CRM. And this is where you'll create your respective mapping rules following the same logic that we discussed in the motions. So here we are taking a waterfall approach where any rule at the top will be looked at first prior to the subsequent rules. Again, remember that any object that is used in the lifecycle events should be considered in the channel mappings. Once these definitions are made up, you will simply update and hit save once those changes are satisfactory. Now that we've created and mapped the lifecycle events, added in our motions and channels, we'll now build out the customer journey. Each motion, as we mentioned earlier, has its own customer journey. And the customer journey makes up the logic at which you go to market, assuming the various functions that you have, as well as the handoffs between each one and their responsibilities being metrics and channels. Here under enterprise, we'll create the customer journey. By hovering over the specific stages, you'll be able to add in a function. So I can add in functions that were already created or simply create a new function. Here I'll add in marketing. And then I'll be able to set the metric at which we report on marketing and also any function handoffs. You'll be able to assign the quota, whether it be team or individual. Since it's marketing, we'll set it as team. And then the assignment type being volume or pipeline. The function handoff from marketing is SDR. Now that we have the marketing function added, I can then add other functions. So if I wish to add an inbound SDR function that's in charge of count of SALs, I can simply add in that inbound SDR function. And then from marketing, I'll click on marketing to then set the handoff to inbound SDR. If I have a partnerships function, I can simply add it as well, maybe covering lead to SAL. So I can add in a function here and add in that partnership function. And there is a subsequent handoff to account executive where both inbound SDR hand off to account executive. So I want to click on inbound SDR and set the handoff to account executive, and from partnerships to account executive. Once we have deals that are closed, there's then a handoff to implementation. So I'll again add that implementation function under the onboarding stage. And again, do the handoff from account executive to implementation. On the left-hand side, you're presented these plus icons that allow you to tag and associate the channels that correspond to each specific function. So the channels are set at the beginning of the journey. So I can set all my inbound channels that feed into marketing and set any partnership channel to flow into partnerships. It's important to have the right side of the bow tie completed in order to save the customer journey. So here I'll add a function on the right-hand side, and it can be customer success. Customer success is measured maybe as a team on net expansion AR. I'll then make sure that there's a handoff between implementation and retention expansion, and this will then allow me to save my customer journey. It's important to note as well that there is the notion of versioning within the customer journeys. So I can have a journey that exists between specific dates, and then there possibly being a new journey that's presented once there is a new date or milestone that is presented. So in order to accomplish that, I would simply click on the dates here, and I would see all the different versions or wish to create a new version. While you're creating your journeys and mapping your channels, your motions, and setting your lifecycle events, there is the mapping requirements, which will essentially provide you any insight in gaps that currently exist in the mapping. So here we can see that mid-market motion that was created is not mapped, or that partner referral channel is not mapped to the CRM. So look at this as your guide as you're building out your customer journey. Beyond the customer journeys, you'll want to create any additional dimensions that allow you to further the analysis throughout the application. So here, these dimensions could be firmographic dimensions. They could be more event specific as well. And you'll be presented the list of these various dimensions below. When you wish to create dimensions, you'll set an icon, a name at which you'll be recognizing that dimension, and then you'll want to set it to be an account level or an event level dimension. An account level essentially means that it's a firmographic or it's a property that applies to the general account as opposed to that specific event. Where we go into event level, the common examples would be opportunity type, furthering essentially where that maybe event took place, or maybe a campaign ID that again pertains to a specific event as opposed to the account. Within account level dimensions, you can pull from either the company object if I'm using HubSpot or the account object if I'm using Salesforce. From here, we're essentially reading that respective object regardless of your lifecycle event mappings, and we're able to set the values to that dimension based on that respective object. You can also look at lifecycle event objects. So if I'm looking at specific events being lead, MQL, SQL, at which I'm picking up that information, but it pertains to the account. Let's say, region is picked up on the opportunity. I can map this at, let's say, that new SAL or new customer event, and then we'll be presented the deal property, which is the object that's used for these specific events. And I'll be able to set or select the properties that I wish to pull from. As we mentioned earlier, event level are really pertaining to those specific events. So they're not impacting the general account as you're looking at specific values throughout the application. At any point, you can leverage the dimension agent to build out these specific dimensions. Think of it as a way to speed up the process and also help you categorize possibly the values that make up the properties. A very common example is if I'm looking at industry from the company, in the CRM, there's possibly over 100 different values. The dimension agent can help me categorize these values in a preferred way. So if I wish to look at industry here, again, I'll be presented with all these various values. I can either map these one-to-one, or I could write out a prompt that can help me categorize these specific values. Once I have the dimension created and it matching my requirements, I would simply hit save. Now that you've created your dimensions, you'll want to have your employees all mapped and tied to their respective functions and existing within Vasco. I'll access my employees here, where they can easily be created manually, or if ever I have an employee that is tied to an event that is picked up by Vasco, it will be created automatically and mapped to its respective profile in the CRM. The only additional step is to assign it to its respective function and role. If I wish to create a new employee, I'll simply put in first name and last name. I can then search for the respective employee in the CRM. And I would then tie its position being the role. So setting it to, let's say, account executive, SDR, whatever the title is of this employee. I'll set their expected start date. I'll put in their compensation, and I'll assign their motion and function responsibility. So if I have a rep that will be tied to events that pertain to the SMB motion, as well as multiple functions, I'll add those allocations where this account executive will be tied to the account executive function, as well as possibly outbound SDR. And I can then set the allocation percentage to be what I represent in terms of their time spent in those respective functions. Once it's created and allocations are added, I would simply hit create, and then that employee is now mapped and assigned in Vasco. Now let's review the radar. The data radar is where all the pieces of the mapping, your customer journey, your employee allocations, your dimension creations all come together. We're able to identify where there are gaps in the entire data model. So I'll be presented both failed events and warnings, and they will be identified by red, or in red if it's a failed event, and in yellow if it's a warning. The difference between a failed event and a warning is such that a failed event will not roll up into any actuals, whereas a warning is simply an allocation issue or possibly an issue with the source of the data point. We'll touch on that in a few minutes. I can also see the trend over time. So if there's been an evolution in the integrity over the last few weeks, I'll be able to see that. I'll be presented the issues. So in this case, I have a list of events that are missing contract value. I could have missing channels. I could have events after one stage. These are all presented in such a way where you'll be able to see all the events and click into it and then open it up in the CRM if you need. In our Help Center, we present a detailed list of all the possible issues that could be surfaced, as well as how to resolve them. Warnings, as I mentioned, are typically allocation issues where events are maybe not associated to a proper employee. Maybe the employee is not even mapped. Or in some cases, if you're using Salesforce and the field is using a calculated field that is not supported, we'll surface that all within this page. On the right-hand side, I can see the integrity tied to any dimensions that have been created, as well as the integrity by employee. Now that you understand where there are gaps in the CRM, it's always important to look at the enrichment rules. The enrichment rules can allow you to speed up the data cleaning process and maybe fill in some gaps that would otherwise be fairly cumbersome to do in the CRM. Let's go through them one by one. You can first activate the fill missing event channels. So if we're able to detect the channel on a event, whereas there's other events tied to the same account that are missing channels, we can essentially associate the channel of the event that has one to the events that do not. You can then set the logic in terms of how we enrich, whether it be the earliest observed channel by date, it could be earliest observed channel by stage, or looking at the most recently observed channel by date or most recently observed channel by stage. You'll also be able to see the list of enriched events where you can click in and then access all those events. And similar to what we showed in the data radar, you can click into those events and access them in the CRM. Set account custom dimensions. So this is where if we pick up a dimension on one event and not on another, you can basically enrich the other events through the account custom dimensions. Again, you have the option to set how the data is then enriched. The auto reconciliation of accounts is when you have multiple sources. So if I'm using both HubSpot and Salesforce or HubSpot and Stripe, I can essentially set the unique property that is used to reconcile accounts, being maybe an account ID, could be the account name, whatever property exists in both systems that can reconcile the accounts. Ignore historical lifecycle events. This is where I can set a cutoff date in terms of when we would be pulling in data from the CRM. So in this case, I'm pulling from August 31st, 2024, whereas I can go back and add data from the previous year if I wish. Deduplicate acquisition lifecycle events. This is where if we detect multiple events tied to the same account, we can dedupe and only count one, as long as it's within the same journey. So if I pick up 5 contacts that converted as an MQL per se, these 5 MQL events can be deduped and only count towards one, as we're selling to accounts and not contacts. Ignore empty lifecycle events. This is where we're missing all information tied to motion value, channel value, contract value, account ID, and contact owner. Automatically add skip stage acquisition events or acquisition stages. This is where if I have an account that goes from lead to SQL and it skipped that MQL stage, I can essentially populate that MQL stage by activating this enrichment rule. The following rule can set how we enrich those missing events, being the date at which we pull. Is it from the former event or the latter event? So am I pulling the date from the lead or the SQL? And this is where you can set that logic. Ignore acquisition stage events after account is won. If I have events that take place tied to an account that is won, so let's say MQL events tied to that customer that's been with us for some time now, we can decide to ignore these automatically. So this sums up the enrichment rules. Now let's review customer profiles. This is where I will build out the different ICP profiles that we are catering to and also tier them so that I can later monitor the performance and the adherence to my various ICP profiles within the Pulse. If I wish to create a new profile, I'll simply hit new profile, and then I'll be able to select the various dimensions that make up this profile. So it could be industry. I could then add multiple conditions that then make up this profile. So industry being financial professional services, as well as high value revenue size. The beauty of creating profiles is the ability to also begin to review the performance of these profiles throughout the entire customer journey. So if I'm looking at multiple profiles, I'm presented a preview panel. So if I add a second profile, this preview panel allows me to evaluate the performance tied to both of these profiles. I can decide to extend the date range to possibly this fiscal year, set the different stages that we'll be evaluating, set the different motions, as well as the metrics at which we choose to analyze. The comparison tab allows you to decide whether it's simple comparison between profiles, which would be the no comparison. It could be versus all accounts that are not profiled, or versus the total accounts that are made up within your data set. Here I can then see the performance tied to count, could be conversion rates, it could be time metrics, as well as velocity metrics being dollar value per day. And this is a makeup of the conversion rate of Sal to the volume to the dollar value divided by the number of days within your sales cycle. Once I have these profiles created, you'll be brought back to the customer profiles page. And here again, you'll be able to tier each of these profiles. So if I have a profile here that's not published, I could simply decide to publish it and tie it to a specific tier. And then this would make up my ICP profiles that are monitored within tier 2. Now let's view the tables and events. The tables of events is all the subset of events that have been picked up within Vasco. So I could, at any point, if I want to look at a specific account name or look at a specific events that took place, I could, essentially find them within the table here. An account within Vasco is the makeup of all the events that are corresponding to an account within the CRM. So I can access the table of accounts here, where I'm then presented with a list of all the accounts, and we actually present these within the bow tie as well. If you wish to see, the number of or all the accounts that make up sales, I can easily click into the 394 here, and then I'm presented all the sales or the accounts that are in that sales stage. I can click into any of these accounts, where I'm then presented a view of the account within the bow tie. And again, an account is a makeup of all the events that are picked up within Vasco that are tied to the corresponding account in the CRM. So here I can see all those specific events. I can open up the account in the CRM. I can see all the various custom dimensions and other information that's presented below tied to activities and time metrics. The filters at the top allow you to further break down the list of accounts. If I want to look at it by dimension that has been added within the data set or by current owner, this is a great way to just break down the data set even further. Destinations is where you can access the data model and decide to send it to a data warehouse. I would simply connect to the data warehouse here by selecting any of the available options, being in this case BigQuery, Snowflake, and Redshift. You are then asked to enter the GCP project ID, the dataset location, the dataset ID, and add any service account keys. There is documentation in terms of how we send the data to the destination, as well as the data schema. The data schema presents all the information that your data team would need in terms of all the different ways at which we formulate the data. So it could be how we break it down by account journey, by account source, by account, by channel, so on and so forth. It's also presented in a diagram where you can easily see the relationship between all these different components. If you're wanting to know the frequency at which the data has been refreshed, you can also access it within runs. So this is where you'll be presented with each synchronization that took place between the data source and Vasco. If you wish to force a refresh, you could easily do this here by simply clicking synced and then refresh. Note that whenever a change takes place to the mapping within Vasco, we are running a refresh automatically. So the use case of hitting synced and then refresh would be if there's been a change in the CRM and you wish it to be recognized within Vasco, quicker than the automatic sync, which typically takes place every 30 to 60 minutes. This sums up everything you need to know tied to the Data Hub. This was really the foundation to all the data that is coming through from your sources to then how it will impact all the other aspects of the platform. Hope this was helpful, and please don't hesitate to reach out to your respective RevOps partner if you have any questions. Thank you.